Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning into the Federalist Files. Today we'll be going over Federalist number 19. The same subject continued, the insufficiency of the present Confederation to preserve the Union, written by James Madison, December 8th, 1787. Topics include separation provides no executive or judicial power. Executive must be fortified to be effective. So in this paper, it's going to be the same thing that we've been talking about the last couple papers. They mention a little bit about feudalism, infighting in Europe. In particular, they cite, I think it's the Netherlands, or they cite Switzerland, I think the Netherlands, and then the Germanic Empire, most importantly. So in this paper, Madison continues to cite institutions that were confederacies to further represent the failings and capricious nature of that type of government, meaning that there was many different variations and formats of confederacies, and they were different in many ways, and he alludes to the failings of those confederacies and why it is that they did fail, and we've gone over this the last couple papers in this one. This is also going to be another heavy historical paper. So he begins here by stating, and I quote, "In the early ages of Christianity, Germany was occupied by 7 distinct nations who had no common chief. The Franks, one of the number, having conquered the Gauls, established the kingdom which has taken its name from them. In the 9th century, Charlemagne, its warlike monarch, carried his victorious arms in every direction, and Germany became a part of his vast dominions." End quote. So, if anybody that's familiar has watched Spartacus, they talk about the Gauls, they talk about the Franks a little bit. They were enslaved by the Romans, and then the Romans brought them to, in Spartacus in particular, brought them to that arena or that whole fighting. I forgot the name of it. I think it was called the Ludus or something like that. That's where all of these warriors would train and fight. So Charlemagne, just a little background information on him. Charlemagne, he ruled, he was king of the Franks in 768, king of the Lombards in 774, and the emperor of the Romans from 800 during the early Middle Ages. And I don't know when he passed. I guess his reign lasts from 800 to 814. I guess that was his death. Yeah, 814 he died. So pretty much just a bunch of conquering going on from him. And Madison continues. He states, "Charlemagne and his immediate descendants possessed the reality as well as the ensigns and dignity of imperial power, but the principal vassals whose fiefs had become hereditary and who composed the national diets which Charlemagne had not abolished, gradually threw off the yoke and advanced to sovereign jurisdiction and independence. The force of imperial sovereignty was insufficient to restrain such powerful dependence or to preserve the unity and tranquility of the empire." End quote. So here, interestingly enough, he's stating a feudalistic structure. Anyone that missed it, it's about 2 Federalist papers ago. We're talking about feudalism. You have the person at the very top, the sovereign, or rather the emperor or king, kind of almost like a monarch. And then below him is nobles, and those nobles pass on certain land to specific individuals, and then those specific individuals is now incumbent on them to fight for those nobles, and their loyalty is to those nobles. And then what would happen is these nobles got very powerful. They would all fight each other to try to gain more land and higher advantage. And the monarch, because they had no power and they were no match for these nobles, they couldn't really enforce the law. They could not do anything. They were really their power was diminished by having having that feudalistic structure. So he continues here, and that's pretty much what he's talking about. He's saying Charlemagne, he gradually was able to take over more and more land by imperialism, and then these vassals and the land of these vassals, it was hereditary, meaning it was passed on from generation to generation. It got bigger and more powerful, and they were able to and Charlemagne was unable to rule over them, and they were able to he was unable to restrain them in their power, essentially. And he continues on this, Madison. he states, and I quote, "The most furious private wars accompanied with every species of calamity were carried on between the different princes and states. The imperial authority, unable to maintain the public order, declined by degrees till it was almost extinct in the anarchy, which agitated the long interval between the death of the last emperor of the Suabian and the accession of the first emperor of the Austrian lines," end quote. So this is, I mean, there's so much information to go off of, talking about the emperor, different emperors, different situations, the different compositions of the governments. So pretty much saying here is exactly what I stated before. He was unable, Charlemagne, to restrain these individuals, and it was nothing but private wars between the princes, and the princes were the people, the nobles, in other words, and their different sovereignties that they owned, and the people that worked for them, that they gave land to and were loyal to them. Now, Hamilton begins with the Germanic Empire, which was represented with powers given to the council as well as an emperor as the executive. So he's going to explain this whole system, and then at the very end, it's going to be one very critical quote he'll have that I'll point out. That is the real main reason why the whole system, even though it seems like it's a federal system and it practices federalism, why it won't work. So he begins this, and I quote, "Out of this feudal system, which has itself many of the important features of a confederacy, has grown the federal system which constitutes the Germanic Empire. Its power are vested in a diet, representing the component members of the confederacy, in the emperor, who is the executive magistrate with a negative on the decrees of the diet, and in the imperial chamber and the Aulic council, 2 judiciary tribunals having supreme jurisdiction in controversies which concern the empire or which happen among its members," end quote. So this one, pretty much, he says, this system has all the components of a federal system, a federalist system. So it should be, it should be successful, right? So you have, so far he's setting out, and when he says diet, he means a council, or rather a Congress, lawmakers. So that is their version of Congress, is they call it a diet. And it's consistent of members of the component members of the Confederacy, so different states. So it's kind of like, I mean, it sounds good on paper. It sounds like it's very similar to our system. The judicial system really isn't the organization is not, it's very rudimentary, but still they have those 3 branches of government. They have the executive magistrate, which is the emperor, rather the president. It's very similar to our system, it sounds, so far. So the next he states, and I quote, "The diet possesses the general power of legislating for the empire, of making war and peace, contracting alliances, assessing quotas of troops and money, constructing fortresses, regulating coin, admitting new members, and subjecting disobedient members to the ban of the empire, by which the party is degraded from his sovereign rights and his possessions forfeited," end quote. So here again, you have the Congress has all these powers, and these powers sound very, very, very familiar to our current system or the proposed constitution. Exactly. I mean, they're very similar in a lot of ways. Troops and money, coining their own, regulating coin. That's something that is our House of Representatives, I believe, is in charge of doing that. Admitting new members is the same thing that they get a chance to vote for. Making war and peace, declaring war. It's a Congress thing in the United States. Legislating, just making laws. That is another Congress thing in the United States. That's under their jurisdiction. So it's very similar to our system. And now he continues, and I quote, "The members of the Confederacy are expressly restricted from entering into compacts prejudicial to the empire, from imposing tolls and duties on their mutual intercourse without the consent of the emperor and diet, from altering the value of money, from doing injustice to one another, or from affording assistance or retreat to disturbers of the public peace," end quote. This once again, this sounds somewhat similar to our system. The imposing tolls and duties on intercourse, mutual intercourse, they would need the emperor and the diet to get that done. The one that I saw specifically, that's nothing like our system. You can't alter the value of the money in any state. That's something that can't be done, whether the Congress agrees on it or the president. I guess if they really wanted to do a state-by-state system, Which, no, you can't even do that because it has to be uniformity. It has to be uniform across. So no, that's something that is not distinct to our system, but it is to theirs, that they can alter the value of money in specific states if they want to, which is it's very weird. I don't know why they would do it. It sounds frivolous. But yeah, and then he continues here. And I quote, "The members of the Confederacy are expressly restricted from entering into compacts prejudicial to the empire, from imposing tolls and duties on their mutual intercourse without the consent of the emperor." Oh, this is exactly what I just said. That's a typo then. Okay, so it's the same thing I just mentioned. So under the written constitutional powers, the emperor has the exclusive, and I quote, "right to make propositions to the Diet, to negative its resolutions, to name ambassadors, to confer dignities and titles, to fill vacant electorates, to found universities, to grant privileges not injurious to the states of the empire, to receive and apply the public revenues, and generally to watch over the public safety," end quote. So this is something that's actually a little bit different, because the emperor, or rather our executive magistrate in the United States, our president, does not have as many powers as this emperor actually has here. No, the exclusive right to make propositions, I guess. The president can do things like that, similar, be like, hey, this is, I'm looking for this legislation, but usually they just talk to their party if they're looking for a specific type of legislation. So to negative its resolutions is very interesting. So our president, our negative, we call it a qualified negative in the United States. Our president has the veto power, which would cause it to go back to the, if a law gets passed through the House of Representatives, writes up the law goes up to the, it gets confirmed by them, obviously, then it goes up to the Senate, gets confirmed there as well by a majority vote, just a regular law. I'm not talking about a constitutional amendment, just a regular law. It gets approved by a majority vote in Senate, or above 60% if they decide to filibuster, which it's a long story. But let's just say, it passes through the Senate as well. Then it goes to the president's desk. The president has a qualified negative, is what they call it in these papers. He can veto it, and then he passes it back to the two chambers of Congress, in which they have to vote 2/3 to pass it through and override the veto. And that's a safeguard in order to protect not only the president's power, but also the people. So the founders, what they thought was the Congress was going to try to take more and more power away from the president. Therefore, he needed that qualified negative. He needed that veto power in order to counteract what they were doing to him if they tried to take his power from him and lay it more in the court systems, or rather in the Congress and in the structure of that council. So, the negative here, it doesn't really say exactly what kind of a negative it is. It could have been a qualified negative, or it could have been an absolute negative, meaning, no matter what comes through Congress, he can just veto it, and there's nothing else to be said there. There's no type of overriding of a veto. So also to name ambassadors, I believe the president in the United States has that power, but they need the Congress to vote through those ambassadors. I'm pretty sure there needs to be an approval from them. To confer dignities and titles, the United States, I believe it's the Third Amendment, it's the Third Amendment. There's no nobility or titles in the United States of America, and that was something that was in Great Britain, and we didn't like it. We hated it. We didn't think, we thought that at that, the all men were created equal idea, laws are supposed to apply equally to everybody, 14th Amendment. So we didn't believe in the dignities or titles. So to fill vacant electorates, that's interesting. I'm not sure the president has that kind of power. I don't think they do. To found universities, I don't think that's a presidential power either. I don't even know if that's a federal government power, to be honest with you. I don't think the federal government really has the power to find universities. So have, federal government funded universities where they create them and they fund them completely. I don't believe that's even in the Constitution, which is also why college can't. That's why there can't really be free college in our system, because the federal government is not given that power. But the legislators, as well as the presidents or the judicial system, they like to kind of make their own rules up sometimes. So who knows if that'll end up passing through or not. To grant privileges not injurious to the states of the empire. That's interesting. Grant privileges I'm not exactly sure what that's supposed to mean. If that's pardons, then yes, the president also has pardon power, so maybe that's what that is, like a pardon. But it's a much more ordinary way to say it, or a complex way to say it. I'm not really sure. To receive and apply the public revenues. That's very interesting. So the executive branch has no power really in applying the public revenues except for approval of a budget. That the purse is all held, those revenues. What is the budget is written up by the House of Representatives, which are supposed to directly represent the people. And that's the point in having it that way. So they don't now receiving the revenues. Maybe it's executive power for taxation if you want to consider the IRS an executive branch, but the president really doesn't impose, restrictions on tax rates. That all has to be passed through the House and the Senate. So this is where the power is really, really different here. Just to begin with, the emperor has, it seems like, more power than our president would have. And generally watch over the public safety, which is just kind of a general statement. So that's just the federal government in general. They say that generalized statement. Now, in terms of the perks of the position, the emperor receives no land or emolument for their service, which I thought was kind of interesting, but it didn't really matter because the emperor at the time was most likely a noble or somebody of money, hereditary money that was passed down, old money. They probably already had some sort of giant mansion or what have you at that time. Now, all these powers considered, it would be supposed that under this system there would be stability in terms of the Confederacy. And then Madison goes on and he explains it and he states, and I quote, "Nothing would be further from the reality," end quote. So the fundamental principle of which this conclusion is drawn is upon the empire's being comprised of a community of sovereigns. And this is the most critical part right here, this quote of the entire paper. He states, and I quote, "The fundamental principle on which it rests, that the empire is a community of sovereigns, that the diet is a representation of sovereigns, and that the laws are addressed to sovereigns, renders the empire a nerveless body, incapable of regulating its own members, insecure against external dangers, and agitated with unceasing fermentations in its own bowels," end quote. So here what he's saying, it is the exact same thing that was explained. I don't know if it was the last video or my video before that. You can't have the federal government or the national government's overreach go directly to the state government or the sovereigns. In this scenario, in this instance, it was the emperor and the diet's jurisdiction went over the nobles that owned the land, the fiefs. They owned these nobles. They were called, I don't remember what they were called, but the annals or whatever, that all the land that they owned, they were just going directly to that noble that owned all that land, and they were trying to enforce the law on him, and then he was supposed to enforce the law on everybody else. And this is why it didn't work. It was the exact Articles of Confederation system where the reach of the federal government and the jurisdiction of the federal government only fell upon the state governments and their officials. If they decide to enforce it, that's at their discretion. That's why this system did not work and it fell. And there was a lot of factional violence that would ensue, mostly religious. The religious was the impetus for it, religion, for whatever reason. Now, he recollects the history of Germany, which is signified by, and I quote, a history of wars between the emperor and the princes and states, of wars among the princes and states themselves, of the licentiousness of the strong and the oppression of the weak, of foreign intrusions and foreign intrigues," end quote. So pretty much, there was infighting, and then, foreign intrusions, foreign countries would come in to help, and they'd be interested, they'd be hanging out from the outside, seeing what's going on, because they wanted a cut of the pie as well. They wanted a piece of the pie. So Madison cites the 30-Year War, which I've mentioned before, and then he states, "Controversies and wars among the members themselves have been so common that the German annals are crowded with the bloody pages which describe them. Previous to the Peace of Westphalia, Germany was desolated by a war of 30 years in which the emperor with one half of the empire was on one side and Sweden with the other half on the opposite side," end quote. So there was a fight. There was pretty much like a civil war from what it sounds like. And then Madison explains the Peace of Westphalia deal. and I'll go on to explain it. I have an article up. And I quote, "Peace was at length negotiated and dictated by foreign powers, and the articles of it, to which foreign powers are parties, made a fundamental part of the Germanic constitution," end quote. So this is actually very, very interesting. So there was this continual battle and these fights from, I want to say it was 900 to 1500, or 900 to 1600, and then that's when they came out with the peace deal, Peace of Westphalia deal. So the most important part from what I've seen is it seems like this was a holy war. A lot of the time it was Protestants versus Christians or Calvinism. Calvinism apparently is a subsect of Protestantism. And at the very end of, once they came through with this peace deal, there was recognition of the sovereignty of not only the lands, the people, and the agents, but also these religions. They did not recognize at this time Calvinism as a religion. The Catholics were fighting the Calvinists pretty much this entire time, and then I think Lutherans are kind of thrown in there as well. But the very important part that he says here is the foreign powers or parties made a fundamental part of the Germanic constitution. So what he means here is, I was reading the tenets of what happened with this peace deal, and it said France and Sweden were recognized as guarantors of imperial constitution with the right to intercede. So when this was all said and done, this whole peace deal, we gave power to France, and we also gave power to Sweden as well, that they now had the right to intercede. I guess that became part of the Constitution, because this was considered the Holy Roman Empire. This was not like the ancient Roman Empire. This was the Holy Roman Empire. It was huge. It really ended, I think, 1806 when Napoleon Bonaparte started practicing imperialism and taking over multiple countries from France. But at this time, it was saying, this peace deal now is incumbent on, we're going to have France and Sweden, and they're going to they will intercede if anything bad happens within fighting, which is weird. That's like, imagine if America, after their Revolutionary War, or even after their Civil War, they passed a peace deal where now at any time, if there's any issues that arise that Spain sees as an issue or Great Britain sees it as an issue, now they can just come right into our country and start fighting with us and try to solve it and suppress it, which is very odd. And that's really what he's alluding to here, is that's what happens when you have an unstable government, you have infighting going on. Then when you invite foreign arms over and foreign countries and foreign influence, then at the end of the day, you get something like that, where now in the peace deal, these other states these other countries have some sort of jurisdiction or superintendence above your country. So he continues, and I quote, "The impossibility of maintaining order and dispensing justice among these sovereign subjects produced the experiment of dividing the empire into 9 or 10 circles or districts, of giving them an interior organization, and of charging them with the military execution of the laws against delinquent and contumacious members." When you mean contumacious, you just mean people that are partaking in illegal activity. So now, because they didn't have the jurisdiction of the federal government, was not working with these sovereign subjects or these sovereign territories, states, countries, however you want to say, because it's not working with them in conjunction, the only way to execute the laws or enforce the law was by the military, which will lead to bloody battles, infighting, the classic stuff that happens, a police state, oppression of the people. So therefore, the Germanic Confederacy was considered a failure that consistently broke out in civil war, foreign influence, and military despotism through the means of separate confederacies attempting to enforce the law on their citizens, which is what I stated. Now, Madison continues on this front. He states, and I quote, They either fail to execute their commissions, or they do it with all the devastation and carnage of civil war. Sometimes whole circles are defaulters, and then they increase the mischief which they were instituted to remedy," end quote, which I think is interesting. So what he's saying is, it ends in civil war, people are fighting back and forth, but then he says, interestingly enough, sometimes whole circles are defaulters, meaning like this entire land, the noble that runs it, no one has been paying into the taxes that they're supposed to be paying, and they've all been avoiding the law or subverting it. And then they increased the mischief which they were instituted to remedy. So these bigger, what was supposed to happen was, these other countries were supposed to keep the other ones in check, and that would not be what would happen. And then they would be the ones that were instituted for the remedy, and they would actually exacerbate the problem and make it worse. So, and then he goes on, and I quote, "It may be asked perhaps what has so long kept this disjointed machine from falling entirely to pieces. The answer is obvious. The weakness of most of the members who are unwilling to expose themselves to the mercy of foreign powers, the weakness of most of the principal members compared with the formidable powers all around them, the vast weight and influence which the emperor derives from his separate and hereditary dominions, and the interest he feels in preserving a system with which his family pride is connected and which constitutes him the first prince in Europe," end quote. So this was the, like I said, the Holy Roman Empire. It was really created, like I said, by Charlemagne when he was able to, also known as Charles the Great, that's what they called him, I guess. He was able to really take over almost all of Europe. He had a far extension of Germany, and then all of the kind of the eastern part near where Russia is a little bit, some of the southern part of where Germany is. So once he was able to take all of that over, he created an empire that they would go on to call the Holy Roman Empire, or the Holy Roman Empire. And it would continue up until, I think, like I said, Napoleon in I want to say it was 1806 from what I read. Now, because of that, and because, like it says here, hereditary, it was in the family at that point. Whoever the emperor was at that time, they were willing to kind of let themselves get stepped on by these nobles just because they were there. They were in that position. They wanted to keep it in the family. They didn't want to do anything about the system. And then the nobles and the weaker nobles, they wouldn't go, I guess, to these foreign powers, and that's why it hasn't completely, at this point, dissolved. From what he was explaining, it wasn't completely dissolved, but over time, this empire, this Holy Roman Empire, did dissolve over time. It got smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually, Napoleon Bonaparte came in and just slammed it home and took them all completely out, and then he added it kind of to his French Empire that he had going on, and then that eventually dissolved because I think he was trying to fight off the Russians, and the Russians do the classic thing that they always do in war. They just keep backing up into the colder and colder abyss, and they put on their jackets and they layer up just like they did in World War I and World War II. And whoever the enemies are end up freezing to death because and especially when it's that cold, you can't grow any crops, so there's no food, and you also are dressed in summer or in spring gear, so you are not prepared. Whereas they know the terrain, the Russians knew at that time how to prepare for this battle that they had, and that's how Napoleon, I believe, that's how he eventually got taken out. Then he goes on. He goes on to summarize other examples such as the Swiss cantons and Poland. And Madison first talks about Poland, and he states, and I quote, "Equally unfit for self-government and self-defense, it has long been at the mercy of its powerful neighbors, who have lately had the mercy to disburden it of 1/3 of its people and territories," end quote. So they had that, because then he, before he was just mentioning how there's weak territories, or there's weak members, principal members, they're weak and they're not willing to go for foreign powers, and they're not going to step up and do anything. And then he goes on to talk about Poland. At this time, I don't know if exactly Poland was part of the Holy Roman Empire. Beforehand, like I said, it was from around 900 to 1800, the Holy Roman Empire, from what I understand, from what I've seen. So, yeah, Poland, they were unwilling to do anything, and its stronger neighbors took about 1/3 of their territories in Poland, as well as 1/3 of the people that were living there. And then he goes on to talk about the Swiss cantons, and he states, and I quote, "The connection among the Swiss cantons scarcely amounts to a confederacy, though it is sometimes cited as an instance of the stability of such institutions. They have no common treasury, no common troops, even in war, no common coin, no common judicatory, nor any other mark of sovereignty," end quote. So yeah, I don't know how that even is considered a confederacy. I don't even know how that's considered a country. They had no common treasury. So they didn't have any revenue coming in. That's what he means for a federal government, to have a federal government structure. No troops, because there was no treasury. No common coin, so there was no equally agreed upon sense of currency, like how we have the dollar here or the penny or what have you. So we have cents and we have dollars here. And there was no judicial system at all. So I don't know, nor any other common mark of sovereignty, which is correct. I mean, there was nothing really. It's just crazy. I don't even know how you live in society like that at that time when everybody else was so much more advanced and at least had like a government system. Here, there's really nothing that unifies or, ensures uniformity in a system. Now, then he continues, and I quote, "They are kept together by the peculiarity of their topographical position, by their individual weakness and insignificancy, by the fear of foreign neighbors, to one of which they were formerly subject, by the few sources of contention among a people of such simple and homogeneous manners, by their joint interest in their dependent possessions, by the mutual aid they stand in need of for suppressing insurrections and rebellions, an aid expressly stipulated and often required and afforded, and by the necessity of some regular and permanent provision for accommodating disputes among the cantons," end quote. So he's pretty much saying they were only around because they were insignificant. They were kind of given their sovereignty from someone before that they were subjected to, some other big country. It's because everyone is kind of unified in the way in which they're homogenous. And this is actually currently today Switzerland and Sweden, a lot of those Nordic countries that the socialists are always citing. They are actually very homogenous still to this day. I believe it's hard to get citizenship there. It's just like Japan. Japan, it's like impossible to pretty much become a citizen unless if you are of Japanese descent. And they do that purposely because they do have certain social welfare system programs. And since they are all homogenous, they mold together as a society better in trying to, build up the group, the reason for that socialist healthcare system. And actually, they had a lot of social healthcare systems, I want to say, in the 90s, and it seems like they're moving further and further away from them because they're realizing that they're bankrupting the system, and they're going towards much more free market means of healthcare, from what I understand. Now, I don't want to get into exact specifics about it, and then on top of that, they call it, I think, the business or the freedom, financial freedom index, I think they call it. But their financial freedom index in those countries are actually way better than they are in the United States, meaning in terms of running a business, it's much easier. There's less regulation. There's a lot of incentives for running business, whereas in the United States, there's a lot of regulation. There's not as much incentive to run business in the United States as there is in those Nordic countries, and then that's why they can then afford to have a social welfare system the way in which they did with their healthcare system. And like I said, they're also homogenous, which gives a sense of unity. Everyone kind of feels that togetherness demographically. And then actually, you know what, it's also found that in those Nordic countries, when they come to the United States, they actually do better in the United States in terms of their income. They make more money in the United States than they do in those Nordic countries, because there's more of a, although there is incentive there, here there's more money to be made, because to compare us to those Nordic countries, it's very odd that we do it, because just in size alone and in population, it's not even close. We exceed them. I'll look it up right now. Switzerland's population, it's not even close compared to the United States. We have 330 million in our country, and from the report in the mid 2019, it's 8.57 million. So you're looking, it's not even close. We're more than 33 times bigger than they are. So to try to compare us and what we should do, our system, to their system, when they run they have such a small piece of a plot of land. I think New Jersey actually has a higher population than Switzerland, to be honest with you. I'm pretty sure New Jersey's population is something like 9 million, if I had to guess. Let's see. New Jersey population. 8 million? 8.6 million? So what did I say? What were they? 8? So it's about the same. Yeah, New Jersey actually has a little bit more people. But that's what I'm saying. We're trying to take a system that's in Switzerland that's as small as Jersey in terms of how many people are there. We're trying to take like a state system and make it a federal system. It just does not work. And there's a lot of things that are different about their economy, the way in which they run it. You know, they're very pro-business. The taxes on corporations are very small there. So we can't do both of what the socialists on the leftist or the Democrat progressive side. We can't high tax businesses, and then we can't also on top of that have a social welfare system. It does not work that way. It has to be, if you're going to have that social welfare system, first off, you have to have closed borders so people don't come in to benefit off that social safety net and not do anything to earn it. And then on top of that, there needs to be low regulation, low tax rates for all corporations and businesses. And then you actually have to high tax. You have to increase the tax on the working class. It has to be about at least 60%. So we can't do both, though. It is unsustainable. It will not work. It's never even been tried because they know it wouldn't work. Unless if they want a complete socialist system. Because then they give socialism is the government just taking the means of production away from the worker. And that's the only time where they've tried to do it. And every time that happens, it just fails, just like Venezuela, Argentina. There's a lot of countries where it just completely fails. A lot of Latin American countries, Cuba. But so he continues here, and he states, and I quote, "The provision is that the parties of variance shall each choose 4 judges out of the neutral cantons, who in case of disagreement choose an umpire. This tribunal, under an oath of impartiality, pronounces definitive sentence, which all the cantons are bound to enforce. The competency of this regulation may be estimated by a clause in their treaty of 1683. The victor, with Victor Amadeus of Savoy, in which he obliges himself to interpose as mediator in disputes between the cantons and to employ force if necessary against the contumacious party," which is, the party doing the illegality, essentially. And pretty much saying that these cantons, they didn't even really have any type of like federal power. They had an umpire, somebody that would regulate and be the arbitrator between the disagreements, which is just weird. And I have some more information on these cantons. I remember looking it up. The cantons of Switzerland, there was 26 cantons. And I don't believe it's like this anymore. It was considered the Swiss Confederation. Yeah, from the 1500s up until 1648. And then they have Swiss until the establishment of the Swiss federal state. So I guess they do now have a federal government in 1848. So at this time, the federal government was not there because 1848 is after 1787. But yeah, it's interesting, to read about all this different information. It starts to kind of make your head spin a little bit. Because you can't even try to find a map for a lot of these places because there's different times in history and you don't know exactly what time of history that they're referring to. So, in conclusion, Madison briefly speaks of the conflicts with the subject of religion. Each canton had its own general government that was based off the religion of the current ruling classes, and which caused a violent transition to power. And Madison cites France as a key influence in the infighting, and I guess they ended up getting involved in the situations, foreign influence, because they probably wanted some of the land or the people that were there. So in other words, there was the general government, and they actually had totally different governments based on what religion you were. If you were Protestant, I guess you lived in this jurisdiction. If you were a Catholic, you lived over here. It's just a mess in Europe in general with the religions, the way in which they fought each other. So that's really going to conclude this one. Federalist number 19. We're going to be doing Federalist number 20. It's going to be the same subject continued. I'm not exactly... I think it is, from what I read a little bit ahead, I think it's another history lesson, but it is going to be different countries, so I do appreciate that. But the main take from this one is it's the same take from the last two. that this feudalist system does not work. You need a federal government that can extend its reach, and the direct object of that federal government is on the people, not the state governments or the council, because those council members or those state governments, they can choose at their discretion whether or not to enforce the laws of the federal government, and it's very important in terms of revenue, tax collection, to build up a military for self-preservation as a country and as a state, and also as a person, as an individual, as a human being. You can't have the rights to afford yourself your own self-preservation. Therefore, a Second Amendment or a First Amendment, if there is no federal government established and there is no court system established to guarantee you that right as a United States citizen. So that concludes this one. I thank you all for watching and listening. Anyone that has not checked out the weekend special, check it out, please. I humbly request. As well as the video I did on Thursday. That one's about the what is that one? That one is about how the liberal elites just disdain the working class American. And you'll see I got videos from Pete Davidson, that viral video that happened in California, Los Angeles. Mayor Garcetti screwing up big time, looking like a moron. So yeah, check those out just to kind of keep yourself in the know of what's going on politically right now. There's, as Sidney Powell would say, the information's coming out like a fire hose. The amount of information, the affidavits, there's thousands of them at this point. And yeah, just give yourself a background of politically what is going on right now. So I greatly appreciate everybody tuning in. Next show is going to be on Wednesday. Thank you very much. Like, share, subscribe. Make sure you drop the mic on people. Everybody have a good one. I will see everybody on Wednesday. Thank you.